You are listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. Sustainable World Radio brings you in-depth interviews, news, and commentary about positive solutions to environmental challenges. Solutions that adhere to the permaculture ethics of earth care, people care, fair share. Are you interested in learning more about permaculture projects around the globe? How to plant a food forest? Restorative design or ethnobotany? Then stay tuned for Sustainable World Radio. I'm your host and producer, Jill Cloutier. My guest today is Monica Gagliano, Research Associate Professor of Evolutionary Ecology and Research Fellow of the Australian Research Council at the University of Western Australia. Monica is the author of numerous scientific articles in the fields of animal and plant behavioral and evolutionary ecology. Monica has pioneered the new research field of plant bioacoustics, and she recently extended the concept of cognition to plants, reigniting the discourse on plant subjectivity and ethical standing. And you can probably tell from Monica's bio that she has done a lot of research about plants, and we're going to be talking about that today in this podcast episode. My guest today is Monica Gagliano. Welcome to Sustainable World Radio, Monica.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you for having me.
I'm thrilled to have you on the show. And we met at the Bioneers Conference last year. Right. Yeah, I heard your talk, and I've been wanting to interview you ever since. So thank you, Skype, for making this possible. So I wanted to give our listeners an idea of how you started. You've been working in marine ecology and biology, and now you're focused mostly on plants. And what caused you to move your focus from the land or from the sea to the land?
That's a very important question, I guess, because I'm not quite sure how it happened. I know definitely it happened. And I still love very much, obviously, the ocean, and I still do work on my marine areas. But somehow, I would say the plants just called me, and it was really, although it might seem like a big jump, from the outside, but for me, a lot of the question that I was already interested in and already trying to address in the marine environment, I was working with fish primarily, have become the sort of same question that I'm interested in answering with plants. And I guess fundamentally is because the same question is, or it needs an answer for no matter what we look at in terms of whether it's an animal, a plant, or even like a microbe. So it's because the question that I started with were already quite broad, suddenly became quite clear that I could address them, or at least try to address them across different systems. And then it would become a more holistic and more system approach rather than specific to a particular species in a particular environment. And so in a way, the jump from the ocean, the evolutionary jump from the ocean to the plants for me was not such a big jump.
You said you're looking at a question. What is it that you're looking at in your work?
Well, I think fundamentally, there's lots of questions. I've got too many questions, but fundamentally, I'm just interested in understanding life. What is life? And so when I was a PhD student, I was looking closely at the relationship between parents and offsprings. And what does it mean for a parent to put forward a really good next generation, basically? But then, of course, as you can imagine, this question could be asked about humans, should be asked about humans, and it could be asked about anything. And ultimately, that movement from one generation to the next, it's about our life, develops and our life moves through time. So I guess, the fundamental question is, what is life? and I'm just trying to paddle my way through smaller questions just to start biting into that bigger question. And I know I'm not the first one to ask that question. I'm sure that most of us asked that question at some point. And certainly many scientists have done have asked this question before, and a lot of them have given some pretty amazing answers. But I guess the answer is always incomplete, no matter how good you are.
I learned a lot in researching your work, and some of the things are very surprising. I can't wait for you to share them with our listeners today. So, if you could share with our listeners what is now commonly acknowledged and generally accepted about plants and plant senses and plant communication, because I did not know that many scientists just say, yes, plants do communicate and they do have senses. Could you share with us just so we know what is more mainstream plant knowledge in the scientific world?
Yeah, mainstream is still a big word. But let's say that I guess all of the topic that you just touched go under what we call behavior. And it's a recent change. Recent, I mean, for the last 20 years, maybe. The fact that we are actually recognizing in general that plants have an ability to behave, which is a loaded word, obviously. That concept just started to develop and be appreciated. And in fact, I think that in general, if you consider the amount of people working on plants, like at least in the academic environment, in the scientific arena, the entire phenomenon is still totally underappreciated. But at least, despite all of this, there are scientists that are definitely at least attempting and experimental testing of plant behaviors. And of course, the communication aspect is one of the places where we have, in general, we have started to look at more closely. And in particular, I think the best developed area of the communication in plants is in relation to how they use their volatile chemicals. And that part of the research, I wouldn't call it mainstream yet, but it's definitely, it found some validation in the mainstream. So it's not so left field and so radical anymore. And but still, it's a quite small area of investigation, considering that we know so little. I would say that is the best that we have at the moment. The rest is still quite on very unstable ground, I guess. So a lot of the other stuff, especially when you move from communication with other systems or other senses, it becomes very heatedly debated. And I would say some scientists, I like to give the benefit of the doubt that most scientists can at least trying to appreciate. They don't have to agree, but they can appreciate. But some scientists have been pretty outrageous in their reaction rather than responses to what the data have to offer.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned is it VOC? So these are chemicals.
Yeah.
So plants are
Yeah.
really like biochemists almost in the sense that
They are
yeah.
the biochemists.
Well, tell us a bit about that. Is this like the chemical vocabulary of the plant? Can you share with us just, like a basic understanding so people know what we're talking about here?
Yeah, sure. Well, I guess in a way that it's a nice way to put it. It is like a chemical vocabulary because the plants are using it to transfer information that are important in their lives. And of course, this is regardless of whether we know what they're saying or not. But what we do know, for example, it was a beautiful. There are a series of beautiful studies, but there was a beautiful study done by colleagues in the US actually, where they can show that plants in a group of plants that have been, say, attacked by an herbivore or they've been damaged, we release chemicals to warn the plants that haven't been damaged yet, but they're close by. So they could be the next target if it was an herbivore, say, for damage. So the chemicals are actually allowing the plants that haven't been damaged yet to have a warning of the situation going on in the neighborhood. And by receiving that warning, they can literally decide to respond and put up their own defenses or not. And they do it. I think that what is coming through the literature is that they are quite selective in how they engage in those responses. So it's not just like, here is a chemical and therefore I automatically trigger myself and release my own defenses or whatever. It's a bit more subtler than that, which again opens up other questions in terms of like, is this purposeful behavior and is it intelligent behavior and all of those, which of course again are very loaded words because they're all concepts that we as humans feel very we feel some ownership on those concepts. So it's like we find it really hard to allow others to have those capacities, basically, if they do.
Right. And really, from what I was reading, it just seems like one of the basic questions is how could plants do this without a head and a
Yeah.
brain?
Yeah, well, the work that I'm doing at the moment is particularly focusing on the aspects of, like, I call them cognitive, because cognition as a definition includes perception, sensing, learning, memory, and we know the plants are doing all of those things. So I don't feel uncomfortable. I don't feel uncomfortable about talking in terms of the cognitive capacities of plants. Cognition is another of those words that is being sort of hijacked, and a lot of the time people automatically assumes that cognition is about brain and neurons, and instead cognition is about a process, and how you get to do that process doesn't necessarily, I mean, as humans and the animals that do have brain, that's our way to do that process, but it's not necessary to have a brain or a neural system to get that process accomplished. And that's exactly where the plants come in, because they do not have brains and they do not have neurons. But what are neurons and what are brains? That's what the real question is. If we look at neurons and brains just as a, neurons, for example, just cells, really specialized cells. They do a particular job, and most at the most basic level, what they do is they're translating electrical signals. So, well, plants are masters in translating electrical signals, and their cells, we just don't call them neurons because they don't look like the neural cells, but they're doing exactly the same job. And so the process fundamentally could be the same. It's just that we're doing it in different ways. And because we're doing it in different ways, we are that different. I don't know. It depends on the level of how deep you're going, I think.
And maybe it's a body brain instead of a
Exactly.
centralized, yeah.
Yeah.
And, really, I could see how if you're looking for a particular thing, like, okay, we're looking for a brain that looks just like ours, you could miss a whole other
Absolutely.
type of understanding or cognition.
And even in humans, I'm sure that anybody that it was gonna be really, really honest with themselves is that we know that a lot of the information and decision that the information that we receive from the outside when we are in the middle of a shopping center or at a meeting with other people, or a lot of the information that we receive from the surrounding environment, including other people, it's not necessarily processed directly by the brain. How many times we say, oh, I have this gut feeling. It's like, yep, your stomach cells are actually responding to whatever stimulus is coming from the outside and then triggering the rest. So it's not that we go around and we have this brain on legs. We also operate at a body level. And I guess in that sense, again, we are not very different at that level from plants or anything else. Maybe the real difference here is that plants and animals and most like sort of living organisms are very embodied. They're very connected to their bodies in terms of like they are really listening to what the body and all the information coming through the bodies are telling them, while we are sort of separating ourselves from our own nature, and that's a whole different story, but it's part of the crisis. I believe it's part of the crisis that we are experiencing at the moment as humanity, and of course is reflected in how we interact with our environment. But
And how we don't interact, right?
yeah,
It's that
exactly.
isolation. Yes, the
That sense of
isolation.
separating from your own nature, so your own body, and therefore inevitably you are separating from nature with the big N, the one around you. Yeah, so I think that what I'm discovering for myself is that the science of plants, done in this way, is actually opening questions which are not about plant biology at all. They are more about humanity and what humans are doing, and what role we are playing and what we are missing and what we need to remember more than what we are learning about plants. But plants have been really good at teaching us through their examples of what they can do and just to remind us of how it can be done.
And we really are so dependent on plants.
Absolutely. Not just us, pretty much the entire planet is.
So let's dive in to your work, and I'd love to start with the bioacoustics, I believe it's called, that
Yeah.
work about plants, and just share with our listeners what that research was and then what information you were taking from this.
Yes, so bioacoustic is the term, the sort of technical term that we use to basically talk about sound, and sound not in terms of music. Well, although obviously music is sound, but sound in terms of like mechanical waves, vibrations, and that kind of stuff. So it's more of a physics type of term than not like entertainment that we human obviously associate with a lot of the sounds that we go and listen to in terms of music. So the study of the plant bioacoustic is not about whether plants like music. I want to make this clear because it's got nothing to do with that, although they might do, but that's not what I'm testing. What we are doing is, well, again, in the story of humanity, the big story, the deep time story, and still today, there is this undercurrent story of humans communicating with plants. And literally, to be specific, there are stories, and these are still alive, as I said, of human receiving songs from plants. And again, the term songs is not necessarily, oh, it's a nice music. It's like this form of communication between the plant and the human in a sort of acoustic sense that becomes an acoustic signal for the human to express it with. So this story of like, yeah, shamans receiving songs from plants and then using those songs as their healing tools, or they're everywhere. If you look, they are everywhere, no matter which country you look, and they are through time. So it's one of those stories that, yeah, sure, it's part of our folklore or ethnobiology, whatever we want to call it. But from an evolutionary perspective, usually the way in which evolution works is either the things that don't quite work, so they just get left behind, right? So for a story like that to perpetuate itself over such a long time, we're talking about millennia, I just thought maybe it's useful. That's why it's still here. Otherwise, after a while, certain stories, they just go. And instead, these kind of practices are still alive. And so I wonder if there is any validity to those ideas, and then whether we can find anything through the scientific method to explore those ideas. So we were lucky, I guess, because how do you start? Like, how do you know whether a plant is emitting anything, a sound, and how do you know whether a plant is able to perceive, listen to a sound? Then we go back to the original question about behaviors, like you for humans or animals, for example, if you are playing a sound and you want to know whether the animal is able to hear it or detect it, or is wanting to respond to it, you have to look for a response, a behavioral response, and usually it involves movement. But with plants, as we know, the movement are at different time scales, so it's really difficult for us to observe. So I think, again, what I'm learning from this work is that we need to let the plants show us, instead of sort of trying to build a case of where they should fit in our framework of what we think they should be doing. So when you do that, you then get surprised because they do show you. And so in this case, for example, for the bioacoustic, basically the behavior that emerged was like we were working on roots of corn, and these are baby corn seedlings, and basically we used very high-tech instrumentation based at the University of Bristol. And this is like a laser technology, so it's non-contact. And basically, it's used by, for what I understand, it's used by the engineers that work with material structures, and they're testing for different materials to build different structures. And they want to know whether these structures are resistant and how they vibrate under certain pressures. So the laser technology is very sensitive to pick up any movement that is imposed on a structure, but it is also very sensitive in picking up any movement that structure has intrinsically. And in this case, it's been applied to animals, and specifically in the case of my colleague, it was applied to the antenna of insects like mosquitoes. So very small scale. And they were looking at how the antenna of these insects would vibrate and send signals out. So then from there to to move from the antenna of a mosquito to the root of a corn, again, the jump is not that big. It's more a conceptual jump than not a technical jump. And in fact, the technical jump is not that difficult because, if you have all of the equipment and the thing that you need at the technical level, you just pretty much shine the laser to the root instead of an antenna. And you just see if there is any signal coming up. If the signal is distorted, it's because the root is moving or is vibrating. And if the signal comes back exactly as it went out, then you know that nothing is happening. And and we were able to detect signals, and they were not just like random noise, but they were like signals that would come a particular interval in clouds, we call them, and of a particular frequency. So then, borrowing from the animal perspective, what we do with animals usually is like, oh, look, okay, this animal can hear within this frequency range. Then you play back a series of frequencies, including the range that you know that they can hear or they can emit. And you see whether they will be able to respond to that frequency or not. And basically, we did the same with the plants. So we played, the plants were at that stage, the corn was emitting frequency at about 200, 300 hertz. So we played frequency between 0 and 900 hertz. And we just looked for a response, right? And the response in plants, again, is like, what are you looking for? The response that came out was that the plants would do absolutely nothing. So the roots grow with gravity straight down. But if there is a sound source that is emitting a sound between 200 and 300 hertz, then the root will start bending towards that sound. And then as you move to other frequencies, they will keep going straight. So obviously is a selective response. It's not just bending to any sound or any noise. It's bending to a particular sound at a particular frequency, and which happens to be the same frequency range that the plant is emitting itself, which makes sense because most of the time we respond to what we can hear.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder if any other creatures like microbes or any soil creatures emit at that frequency.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. I know that, for example, for bacteria, there are beautiful studies done on chemical communication, and that it's actually quite a well-established field now. And they know that chemical communication between different bacteria is used to make, group decisions. So well, if they're making group decision at the bacterial level, because they do interact, and we know that together with the fungi, they do interact with the plants, and there is this threesome going on often where they are trading for different information and different nutrients between the three groups. So it wouldn't be surprising that they're looking for, trading chemicals and having a sort of business meeting with their own frequencies, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, so maybe the soil is underneath our feet is just a symphony of sound.
Yeah. Pretty scary to think about that because we can't hear it. But yeah, and maybe it's a blessing that we can't hear it. It would be very overwhelming, I think.
We would. So basically, so you're observing that the corn then would move toward a certain frequency, go straight with another one. So what does that tell you?
Well, what it's telling me is that the corn can certainly hear is not the appropriate word, but you know what I mean? It's like it can sense and perceive the frequency meeting the root, basically, as it moves through the soil. And this vibration is conveying some information of some kind that is obviously interesting to the plant. And we don't know what that is, but obviously the plant has decided that when there is a sound of 200, 300 hertz, I'll bend towards it. And when the other sounds, either I can't hear them or I don't care. And then to distinguish between the two is another subtlety, because it's like, well, is the plant deciding not to turn towards the other frequency because it decides that is not interested, or he can't hear them because it's outside the sort of perception range, the same as we can't hear ultrasound or infrasound. So it's not that we are deciding not to listen, but we can't hear it. But sometimes, as you know, we are very good at being in a room, someone is talking to you and is within your audio range and you are not listening.
And these were seedlings. Have you tried with larger or older plants?
No, it's like at this stage, and that's where I think the next step is. At this stage, I think that the main limitation is a technical limitation, and it was always a technical limitation, like for a while. And I think to move I mean, we have tried the same machine we have tried on trees and like small trees. But it's just, yeah, technically we need to be able to bring that laser outside, and it needs to be able to be outside happily, like as a machine that is actually functioning properly. And I know that the company that made those laser, and they occupy a room at this stage. So just to give you ideas, like there's not like, oh, just roll it out in the park. It's like it doesn't work that way. They are sitting in a big room, and the room is all soundproof, so that there is no other confounding effects. But I know that the company that made these lasers are also working to develop like sort of more portable outdoor version of the same. But whether this is going to be sensitive enough to pick up and distinguish between, because, you know, of course, outside there is all sorts of noises and sound of things happening. So yeah, it's a technical question, but we have some very amazing smart engineers around. So
It's incredible. And so you mentioned it briefly, but the plant time versus human time.
yeah.
That would probably make some of this research and experiments hard. And when the plant was moving toward the 220 hertz, was it
Yeah.
moving very slowly? Was it in plant time?
Yeah, it was. It is. Yeah, it's like that band, which is not very much. If you see from the picture that is published in the article, original article where this research was reported, it's probably a couple of centimeters, not even that, the entire root, and the band is like it's probably half a centimeter, but it's very clear. And that just there took about 6 hours for the plants to achieve that. But that's how they do it. They're not in a hurry.
I know. It sounds good, actually. I could use some plant time too.
I think that the entire world would need some more plant time.
Exactly. And so, is there anything else you want to share with our listeners about the bioacoustic research and experiments that you were doing?
Well, because I'm working on some sort of aspects of the plant bioacoustic that could be applicable to, you know, question of plant management outside. But as I said, the technical aspects are really quite limiting. So we have done a few other experiments, and I can't quite give them away yet because I'm in process of publishing them, and this is how it works in academia. It's like it needs to be published first, then you can talk about it. And so I will talk about it another time. But basically, it's looking really promising. I'm really happy because the kind of stuff that we have been doing is pretty much like addresses very practical questions in relation to plants and plants management. Yeah, I think that people will find it interesting, especially, yeah, in a more applied sense, rather than just be like, oh, this is nice science, but who cares? You know, like it's cool, but and so what? So yeah, I think that we are able to address some questions that are going to be interesting for a few people, so beyond the, you know, the scientific discovery. So I think that would be exciting, but unfortunately it's top secret for now.
And that means more like you could use it to grow plants, is the
Yeah.
applied. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, I won't pry anymore. Okay. Now, some of your work too was very, very fascinating. The work with the mimosa, is it pudica?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Pudica. And in your research with this plant, which is the sensitive plant, and you can tell our listeners more about that. And we had that. I lived in Hawaii, and we
yeah,
had a lot of sensitive, and we'd always poke them, you know, and watch them close
yeah.
up. But in this research, one point I wanted to start with was you decided to treat the plant like an animal. And why did you make this decision, and how do you think that affected the research? And then just tell us about this. It's really interesting.
Well, firstly, this is really the part in terms of research that I'm developing the most at the moment. So the entire area of learning, memory, and literally decision making is the part that I'm interested the most, because ultimately communication, like the bioacoustic communication is great, but if you think about it, it's like, why would you communicate? Whether you're doing with chemicals, with sound, or whatever else. So ultimately, you're doing it because you're trying to transfer, share information so that you can learn and perform better and increase your chances of survival and produce more flowers or whatever it is that you are doing, depending on what you are. So I guess the learning question and the memory question and the intelligence question is sort of a layer on top of this. And I'm mostly interested in this right now because it's so exciting. And the reason why I feel I'm sort of cheating, but in a good way, because as an animal ecologist, I'm very familiar with the animal framework and how we ask this kind of question when we talk about animals. So for obviously for animal ecologists, it's not a problem to talk about behavior of animals. But when you look at the area of, plants, yeah, talking about, as we said before, plant behavior is an issue because behavior is somehow, whether it's consciously or unconsciously, attributed to movement. And because the scale, as we said, are very different, people just like, but plants don't behave. But behavior doesn't, if we remove the idea of like movement is the selection criteria by which you're behaving or not, then we are freeing up a lot more space. And actually, there are plenty of animals that don't necessarily move that much, for example, when they're catching their prey. Not all animals are chasing their prey. There's a lot of animals are sort of sit and wait type of strategies, and then they just clutch onto their prey at the last minute. And we know that some plants do that too. So suddenly then the line gets a bit more blurry. But I guess there are two things here. One, I'm not trying to make plants become animals. So plants are plants and they have their own worth and beauty for what they are. And they don't need to become or be like animals or humans to be recognized for what they can do and appreciated for what they are. But on the other side, so there's this double, it's a bit paradoxical, but on the other side, I am using the framework that we have used before for animals because it's so well developed and so well accepted as a framework to test whether plants have this kind of capacities. So I'm not expecting them to perform like an animal, but I'm giving them the same sort of arena to play and show us what they can do. And I think this has been very fruitful because, again, in most of the studies and, across the universities, most of the people working on plants are working on plants in terms of like physiology. They're biologists primarily. So they're looking at plants as, you put the plant in a petri dish, you disintegrate the organism, the entity, the one being, you put it on a petri dish and then you just start describing different cells and that kind of level. And of course, there are many as well that they are working as ecologists, but there are so few in comparison. The idea that plants could be what we call like an agent, so they have agency, they have their own will in a sense to life. It's very very borderline. So even the ecologists that are looking at plants in a bit more holistic way are still looking at them as objects, basically, not subjects. And so they don't have their own internal life, basically. They're just reacting to the environment. So the idea of bringing the animal framework is to bring that subjectivity into the picture and then allow the plants to show us whether there is subjectivity or not, whether they can show us in one way or another, or maybe not. But what I've learned is like that they're pretty happy to show us.
Well, and it makes more space, I would think. You're not looking at it with a little your idea of what could happen. So, can you describe what you did with these mimosa plants and what happened? I can't wait for people to hear.
Well, the first thing I should say is like, really, even if what I'm about to share sounds really horrible, no plants were hurt in the process of this experimentation.
The people for the ethical treatment of plants will not become.
It's like, I want to make that one clear. Let's say they were scared a little, but just for a little while. And then that's the point. They were so good at these tricks that they realized that there was no need to be scared. So basically, I created this sort of controlled drop system. That's how we called it. And basically, a mimosa, the sensitive plant, was chosen as a model because it's got this capacity of like closing its leaves really rapidly. So at a human scale,
we can
actually
it.
observe something. Yeah, exactly. And it does this, as you know, in nature if it's disturbed. So you touch it and it closes the leaves and you can see it, right? So there's something to measure that we can see. Then what we did is like we needed to come up with a kind of disturbance that was not something that it would be experienced in the natural environment. Otherwise, what we would know is that the plants might have already like a sort of genetic background, like through time, the plant has sort of acquired this response of closing your lips when you're disturbed. And if you give it in a scenario which is what it normally experiences, it already knows what to do basically. And so it's not really showing you what we call learning in the sense of like something that is acquired through the experience, that an individual, it's a behavior that an individual develops like through its direct experience or by being taught by others or by watching others. And, you know, we know this, obviously, we are hoping our kids are learning at school that way. So the idea was to trying to find a way to provide a disturbance which would trigger the closure of the leaves. But it was something that the plants couldn't have experienced before in its evolutionary history. So that's what the control drop system came in. So basically, we created this drop system, which means that the plant was sitting inside its own pot and sort of inside a vessel, and the vessel was attached to this sort of steel bar, and the plant was raised in its little vessel of about 15 centimeters and literally let it fall. And of course, it was a control fall, so it was always from the same height, which is not very much. And it was falling because it's attached to this metal bar, is sort of like just railing down with gravity. And at the bottom of the fall, we had this foam sort of base, which was, you know, it was cut out so that the vessel where the little plant was sitting would fit exactly and sort of allow for the impact to be, you know, controlled.
Yeah.
So again, it sounds really hard. It sounds like torture, but the plants were really good. And actually the results are the interesting bit because they actually demonstrate that it takes very little to the plants, which obviously has never experienced being dropped from like 15 centimeters are attached to a rail. The plants realize pretty quickly that this is not something to worry about. So the reason why they close their leaves as like instinctively in nature is because they are disturbed and they are doing it as like a defense tactic. Because when they close their leaf, they got really spiky thorns and they show up. And so they might be like at least less, they look a little less appetizing for a potential predator. And sometimes, as you know, I'm sure, if you disturb it properly, it droops completely, all of the leaves, and it looks like it's playing dead. This is a reflex. This is an innate response that the plant has learned in terms of evolutionary history. In this case, we have used this in sort of instinctive response and see whether the plants could show us through this instinctive response whether it would learn something that was happening that is totally new. And the plants start, of course, the first time that they drop, they close their leaves and they droop. And that's exactly what they should be doing because they don't know what's going on. They don't know whether this is actually a situation of danger. So this is the right response to show. And it's the instinctual response. But then if this event, in this case the drop, keep happening, then and nothing follows, nothing bad happens after that, then it would be meaningful for the plant to stop responding by closing the leaves, because every time that they close the leaves, they lose opportunity to feed on and photosynthesize. So there is a trade-off here, and the plants do exactly that. They are able to detect the fall and decide that it's no longer something that they should worry about within seconds.
Wow.
So within seconds, you're still dropping the plant and they're like, yeah, whatever, I'm reopening my leaves. This is totally something that I can ignore because it's not important to me and it's not dangerous.
Wow.
And so as I said, is like no plants were really hurt in the process of experiments, and they showed us that.
How many times? So, did you drop them how many times in a row before they would stop closing up?
So the way in which we set up the experiment was to have a fixed amount of drops and that to be repeated over throughout the day a number of times. So each sort of train, that's how we call them, was consisting of 60 drops. So 60 drops constantly happening one after the other, and then a pause, or say an hour, and then another train, another 60 drop happening, and then another pause. And those trains were like, there were 7 of them throughout a single day. But from the very first train, so the first 60 drop lot, the plants started to reopen their leaves after the second drop. So the first drop, they closed them. After the second drop, between the second and the third, usually some plants already started like, oh, okay, there's nothing to worry about this. So this
Wow.
is how rapid the learning process was. And the reason why we did it multiple times throughout the day is because we really wanted to make sure that the plant really got it. And then we gave them a month of like complete leisure time. They didn't have to do drop. They didn't have to, we just watered them and kept them happy. And when you come back after a month and you present that same old drop again, the plants remember knows exactly what's going on, and it doesn't need to relearn it. And that's exactly the process of learning, is that you don't need to relearn something that you experienced before. You learned it the first time, and you show me that you learned it by remembering and doing, changing what you would normally do, so your instinctive behavior, the next time that event occurs. So the plants don't close their leaves as they did the first time around, because they already know that there is nothing to worry about the drop that they remember from a month before. And so you're dropping them and their leaves are totally open and they don't care.
Wow. So that's really some memory that you're
Yeah.
demonstrating here, learning and discernment almost to know
Yeah.
the difference. What
Yeah.
about, did you test? So you had that group in leisure. Did you try annoying them enough to where they would close? Did they close for other things?
Yeah, that's the thing. And this is an excellent question, and probably is the most important part of the experiment, because one thing is showing that the plant is not responding anymore, in the sense of like it's not closing its leaves anymore. And there is another thing though to demonstrate that is choosing to do that because you learned from previous experience, or is so exhausted by the entire setup that it's not responding anymore because it can't. So that is the test that we did. That is called, in technical terms, is called dishabituation. So the habituation test, habituation is, we do it too, and is the learning test of the 60 drops. While the dishabituation is exactly what you said, is like you, in the middle of the training, you provide a signal or a sort of testing response to something that is similar in nature. So in this case, both testing signals were of mechanical nature, but it's not quite the same. So instead of being a drop, in this case, it was a shake on a on a shaker plate, the one that we use in chemistry. And of course, you do it only once, because otherwise the plants might habituate about that too. So, and when you provide in the middle of the training, you provide that dishabituation test. So you shake it rather than drop it. The plant droop and closes all its leaves because it's like, I don't know this. It's new. And it's exactly what it should be doing. And then 5 minutes later, you retest it on the drop stimulus, and the plant is like, oh, I know this one, and it doesn't bother closing. So it tells you two things. One, the plant wasn't exhausted because I dropped it so many times. It wasn't like sensory adaptation or fatigue or any of those things. It was simply like, I don't need to close about this because it's no danger. And then when the new potential danger comes in, because it's still in potential, so the plant hasn't experienced enough to know what it is, then the safest thing is to go to your instinct and like, yeah, I'm going to close, and then decide whether it's worthwhile or not. And that's the dishabituation test. So that was actually, thank you for bringing it up, because that is really critical to distinguish between real learning and just like, well, it's not responding. That's it, done.
Do you have any ideas on how? So you've demonstrated that this happens, but how? That's the question, I guess.
I guess this is where I'm really hoping that, because as an evolutionary ecologist, I'm interested in the ecology of things, which means the relationship between, the organism and the environment, and how we learn and how we do things in at the organismal level. These kind of question on how, so the mechanistic questions, I think there are questions for our physiologists. And I really hope that they will get onto this and really do it, because I know that there are some amazing people out there that could answer this question if they were prepared to, go there. So, of course, I have a couple of ideas, but this is not really my area of expertise. So I don't really want to put my plants in a petri dish. So, but as I said before, what is the difference between a neuron and a cell that is doing exactly the same job? So the plants have of course, they lack brains and neural tissues and neural systems, but they have very sophisticated signaling networks in their cells, which are just pretty much the same, very similar to the same signaling network that animals have to do like memory processes and all sorts of stuff. So some of these signaling networking involve like calcium. So plants are amazing. Like calcium signals, they are really masters on this. So again, that could be at one venue where calcium channeling, calcium signaling might be an area where we could work out how or whether this is the part that contribute to the formation of, memories. But it's just an idea. And of course, if we wanted to say more from an electrical perspective, so electrical signaling, we know that that's what neurons do, and maybe that's what plants do as well. And of course, the calcium models is included in that system anyway. It might be, a even deeper level, genetic level, which again is not my area. So I wouldn't want to blah, blah about something that I don't know. Yeah, so at those deeper level, I think that we are likely to find that the systems are not that different. So then again, it's like what is really doing, and this is, I think, the part that makes some of my colleagues very uncomfortable, is that what is showing us is that the fact that humans, for example, and some animals have brains and neurons is unbelievable. It's so sophisticated, so beautiful. From an evolutionary point of view, it's like, wow, to create this system, amazing. What a solution. But it's just like exactly that, a solution to one problem, one way of dealing with the environment, which everyone, no matter brain or no brain, has to deal with. Although it's sophisticated and amazing and whatever, it's not necessary. So it's not like the essential requirement for learning. So it's not that if you do not have brains or neurons, you cannot do learning or even more complicated stuff. It's just simply you do it in a different way. And you organize your internal bits and pieces in a different way to do exactly the same task. So I guess it depends whether we want to give importance to the how, the mechanistics, or the process. And because as an ecologist, we pretty much look at processes more than mechanistics. So it's like, I'm biased. Of course, I say, oh, the process. That's where the cross-disciplinary work becomes not just an option, but essential. I'm not a physiologist. I need to work with physiologists to address those questions. And the physiologists are no ecologists, and they need us to allow them to bring those information that they are so specific to a broader picture of processes. So yeah, it's opening up questions that are of boundaries that we're not sure. I'm not sure whether a lot of us are prepared to cross yet.
Exactly, because it kind of takes us off our pedestal at the top
I
of the heap.
know. It's sad, isn't it? We're not at the top of the world. Oh no.
I know. Well, it hasn't served us well, I don't think.
No, and that's exactly why.
Well, so this brings me into what effect do you think? So if we're de-objectifying plants and we're thinking like, oh my gosh, there could be more there than what, it opens you up to a whole new level of sensitivity. What effect do you think this will have on us as a species and as where we are in time right now?
Well, I'm really hoping it's got a really important effect. If you don't mind, I'd like to introduce a concept that comes from the humanities, actually from the education area, and it's called plant blindness. And the reason why I like to bring up this concept is because I think in the late 1999 maybe, or around that time, a couple of people from education, they came up with this model of plant blindness. And what they defined plant blindness as this inability to see plants in the environment. And then they added that this inability to see plants actually leads to to an inability to recognize their importance in the environment, but also to us, human affairs. So, and the reason why they thought we don't see plants, there were two reasons. One is like that literally our human visual information processing system, as we said before, doesn't quite get it. They work at a different time scale, and so we find it really hard to see them because we don't see them literally. But because they were educators, they were like, well, if you start with a early and mindful education about plants, and you couple that teaching earlier on with direct experience of growing plants and being connection, then you can overcome what they call they define plant blindness as the default condition. We by nature can't see plants, but how about if we overcome it by helping each other to see plants? And of course, the reason why I wanted to bring this up is because I think that this, in a nutshell, is the answer to the question, like, what does it mean to see plants differently? What does it mean to see them as subject, as agent, instead of objects? And of course, that comes with a suite of responsibilities, both morally, ethically, legally, which we have to. There is no, on this one, there is really, I don't think, much of a choice. Is like, we have to come to terms with, because the way in which we've been going on by using plants as objects is obviously not working.
Mm-hmm.
It's not working. It's not going to work. It can't work. It doesn't respect life. And plants are a big chunk of that life. At the moment, without them, we really can't do. So it's like at the moment, we don't have a choice but to grow. And really, we are the kids at school, and we are just needing to be taught again mindful education, direct experience with plants, go and connect.
Mm-hmm. And if anyone needs a lesson in that, my first memory is actually of, I must have been about 2, is looking at the little clover. I think it was clover, tiny little flowers. I was squatting down in the yard, and I remember seeing those. And it was like a whole world. And I am hopeless with directions. I think I have directional dyslexia because all I do is notice the plants. It's like,
Well,
oh,
it's enough, isn't it?
yeah, it's the street with the big tree with the pink blossoms. So I definitely have that plant awareness, and I just love plants. So it's been so wonderful to talk with you. So your work really could pave the way for people to gain, instead of plant blindness, plant awareness and connection.
Yes. And I think, who was it? I think there was an article in The Economist by, the father of social biology, Edward O. Wilson. And he was referring to this time, this epoch in the history of the planet. Again, you can see from how anthropocentric and so full of ourselves we are, because we decided that this tiny spit of history in the history of the earth was going to be called the Anthropocene. So it's all about the human, it's all about the man. And he actually, I thought very elegantly, said like, no, I think actually this is a better term to refer to this time would be to call it the Erimocene. That is the age of loneliness. And it's the idea of loneliness in the sense of like, alienation, and this, I think probably even clinically it can be done, this sense of like separation and sort of feeling alone in the world because you have cut off your bonds of kinship with the rest of the world. So then it's a sort of anxiety that we are all in because we are trying so desperately to find where we belong, and we already belong. It's just everyone else's, the non-humans around us are just waiting for us to see them. So I think I am already working with a colleague, and we are actually about to publish a paper about what would it look like to consider, for example, the legal rights of plants. And of course, it's like I'm pretty sure that it's gonna upset a few people because we already seen what happened with the reaction in 2008 or 9 when the Swiss government, the ethics committee in Switzerland, decided to, consider plants as moral beings and give them like some sort of ethical standing. And the responses were like, this is ridiculous, this is absurd, oh, so we can't do plant biology anymore and all of that. And it's like, well, maybe not. And so what? Maybe we need to, move on and release our personal agendas and look at the bigger picture. But yeah, so we'll see, because since 2008, of course, there is a lot more science that has happened. And if we are guiding our decision based on science, it's not necessarily the best one or the worst way to do it. But if that's how we're doing it right now at this time, then science is actually showing that plants have more to them than what we have given them credit for. So some of these decisions, for example, in terms of ethics and legal standing, should be revised.
Mm-hmm. And that brings in the whole diet question.
Yep. Yeah. So that's what I mean. As I said at the very beginning, it's like, I think this, and that's probably what is really keeping me excited. It's not so much the little experiment. Like, the little experiment is important, but the little experiment in the context, then it becomes something a bit bigger and beyond the science of the little experiment itself. So in that sense, I don't really care if some of my colleagues are uncomfortable with some of the findings. The way in which it's done, I know, is done properly in terms of scientific integrity, and the data there. Do whatever you like with how you interpret your data, but the data are speaking pretty clearly, so we then need to act accordingly. Otherwise, we are saying one thing, we're saying, yeah, we want science to guide the process of decision making, and then we don't listen. And again, this is part of our way of conducting ourselves, isn't it? It's quite common.
And with
Yeah,
animals too, this reminds me of the whole animal debate. Oh,
of
animals
course.
have no feelings. Animals can't have feel no pain.
Yeah. And anybody that owns, like any dog owner or pet owner would know that that's absolutely ridiculous. But anyway,
So let's imagine that you could look 100 years into the future. Where do you think your research is leading? What might we be discovering about plants in the future if you had to guess?
well, I cannot guess, but I can make a wish. Because guessing, it's like,
Right.
this is what I wish it might happen, that my science becomes totally useless and totally like not needed. And that is the best wish that I can wish to myself and my work. And the reason why is because it won't be needed, because we would have learned, and we won't need to have science to show, oh, you see, plants are actually not just lifeless objects, but they are amazing living beings. We won't need the science to show them that. So my science will be totally redundant. And that's what I really wish for.
Oh, that's great. So we would have direct experience.
Yes, and then there won't be need of validation from the outside of some other area that we decided, in this case science, that is going to be the one telling everyone how. Because we've done this before with religion. Religion has told us how things are supposed to be, and science is doing the same. And it's like, how about we take responsibility and we go and find out directly and know what it is right? Because I think everyone inside knows what it is right. Yeah, that's my wish.
I love it. So, Monica, if someone wants to get a hold of you and find out more about your work, where can they find you online?
Yeah, I think the address from my work, my email address at the moment, is the one to use. I am about to move. In about 6 months, I finish the contract where I am, and I'm literally applying right now for a new position elsewhere in Australia, but somewhere else. Hopefully, if they don't freak out too much and they they like what I do, they will give me a job, and then we can keep the conversation going.
I will update your contact info once you
Yeah.
know where you're going to be. And is there anything else that I didn't ask you that you would want to share with listeners today?
The only thing that I can say is that, which maybe would be of interest to some people, is that I have been collaborating. I'm really proud of what we've done with someone from Georgetown University. She's an associate professor in literature, and another colleague here in Australia who is an eco-criticist and poet. And we have a book, it's a collection of essays from across the disciplines. So you have science, philosophy, performing arts, cinema, literature, whatever you can think of. We have like amazing academics contributing to the one theme. There is two books actually. One is about the language of plants, and the other one we call the green thread. And the idea is like initiating this dialogue with the vegetal world, but seeing it from all of these different perspectives, and see that in the end there is probably a common message throughout, no matter from which angle we're looking at. And it is this idea that plants are no objects and we need to change that. It's a paradigm shift. So I guess, yes, some people might be interested to know that this, especially the green thread, should be coming out sort of soon.
Where can they find them?
It will be published with Lexington Book, and I think probably towards the end of the year, in a few months, it will be officially out. So it will be available with the publisher. But I think that it's just, I feel the power of this is like that is really doing this multidisciplinary dialogue where everyone is chipping into the discussion, and it's not like, oh, it's all about the science view, but it's about this more complete view that comes from all these different angles, and which ultimately seems to drive one same point of like, respect, honor. Plants have their own worth and dignity just because they're alive.
It's so true. And it's like the plant nature, the nature of plants. It doesn't have to be human or animal. Oh, well, thank you so much. It's been so wonderful to speak with you today.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. You can find us online at sustainableworldradio.com and also on iTunes. For more information about permaculture and ecology, visit the Sustainable World Media YouTube channel, where you'll find videos about permaculture, aquaponics, organic gardening, rainwater harvesting, and much, much more. Sustainable World Radio is a listener-supported program. If you like what we do, please consider making a donation to the show. I'm your host and producer, Jill Cloutier, and thank you so much for listening.